Um, my name is Kim Rapp, if you don't know me. Been around snowmobiling for quite a while. About 8 years ago, I left state government. I'd worked in state government for about 31 years, state of South Dakota, state of Wyoming. And in 2004, started Trails Work Consulting with the goal of trying to help snowmobilers with a lot of different topics. And here we are today. So. The topic today that was given us is increasing snowmobile access, reducing conflict. Again, there's a lot of stuff to cover there, so we're going to run through a lot. We want questions through it. I'll try to get through some things, and then at the end, I promise that we'll spend some time with trying to get you informed as we can with the hour. To me, access is all about building relationships. It's all about relationships. And sometimes those relationships have some symmetry and you follow kind of the curves and the angles, and other times they're really different things. But in the end, you need to work towards relationships if we're going to have access. Access requires a lot of work. It does not just happen. It has to be a priority. You have to be patient. You have to work the process, the persistence. You have to understand others' needs, honesty, follow through. First and foremost, you got to be a credible partner. You got to be credible in the process of your building your relationship, whether it's private landowners, public landowners. We're going to talk about both of those pieces because riding our trails and riding out there, as much as we would like to think it's a right, it's really not. It's a privilege. And so we have to work hard to work with that. There are a lot of different challenges for snowmobile access, and again, generally public and private. We often get in this box and think, well, we're private lands, we're public lands here, and we're different. It's like, no, you know, we've got a lot of commonality with what we do. And so, first of all, we need to understand with access is that I don't care what the recreation is, whether it's snowmobiling, ATVing, kayaking, hiking, bird watching, there are impacts out there, environmentally and socially, and therefore we need to recognize those, accept them, and manage it. That's the key to it, is managing it is how we get our access. Landowners, again, private or public, they need assurance that that recreation use is not going to impact their lands. Even if they're a mining company, they're sensitive about the environment, okay? So all of these folks own their land, they're proud of it, they want it respected. And then trespass, as we work the whole bucket of access issues. Trespass, whether it's public lands and wilderness and, you know, legal motorized, non-motorized areas or private lands, it's probably our #1 hurdle as far as getting assurance from our landowners that we need to be there. And the bottom line is that we need to be showing these partners in these relationships that we are responsible recreationists and that we're somebody they can trust to partner with. And again, generally, been around this for a long time, there are 3 things. I don't care where you go, what lawsuit you read, the sight, sound, and smell of snowmobiles. It's the 3 major objections, if you will, to snowmobiling access. And so we know what the target is that's on our backs, and therefore we need to work at trying to sell that message that, you know, those are really things that can be managed, can be overcome. The sight is the thing that's difficult, but, you know, the evolution of snow camo, I love that. You know, it's kind of a pun in a way, but at the same time, I think we need to be sensitive in some places that, you know, we like our bright colors with a lot of our sleds and our suits, but when we are out there in a multiple use setting, sometimes there's a place to kind of tone it down, but again, we're never going to win that one, so that's one we can just simply decide to have fun with. On the sound perspective, we have done a lot as a snowmobile industry and user group over the years. When you look at some of the early evolution of the snowmobiles, we truly have reduced sounds by over 94%. Our trick today is enforcing the sound laws. Our stock snowmobiles are coming out in a sound level that will be okay for our access. It's when we get into the modifications that really gets us in trouble, and we need to take that a lot more seriously going forward in respect to access. The smell, again, what we have gained through the EPA regulation, as hard as that has been, as expensive as it's made our snowmobiles in some respects, it has truly helped on the emission side, that smell perspective of it. The evolution of the four-stroke, the direct technology on the two-strokes. I mean, we've just made tremendous strides just over the last 5-6 years, and certainly over the last 10 years. So we have a different thing, and we need to sell that message, and we need to understand what that is. There are two tools, and I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to introduce it early here, but we have a wealth of information available out there in two products that we've worked on. In 2008, through federal highway money, the Access Guide, the short name of that, was published. It's 2 volumes, but it's built so that it can be printed off the websites. You can download it, put it in a notebook, the pieces that apply to your area. You don't have to do the whole thing, but there's great resources. And then from that, in 2009, AXA worked to produce this what they call the Blue Book, but it's really the truth, the facts and myths about snowmobiling, and it takes a lot of things condensed out of the Access Guide and puts it into use. So I'll refer back to that, but the bottom line is that this Access Guide is a tremendous tool. Pretty much everything from here forward is in the Access Guide, okay? So I don't have a handout today. You can go to the website, you can go to the internet and get this stuff. When we talk about private lands, there are primarily 6 different issues that we have to deal with as we're trying to get our access and retain our access, okay, because things change. But first and foremost is that we need to understand that there are potential conflicts with landowners' use of their property. We'll talk about that more in depth. There are changing business needs or demands or interests of the owners, and we have to respect that and work within that framework. Again, they have concerns about environmental impacts. Again, whether they're a farmer or a residential owner or a mining company, they are all concerned about that. And then we have a huge one in there. To me, the potential off-season impacts of what happens on their land because we have a snowmobile trail there in the wintertime. We have to get engaged in managing that because that's how we're losing some of our existing access. The administrative headaches, you know, we're simple snowmobilers, but sometimes we don't make things very simple. So while it's important to have good paper trails and risk management, at the same time, we can't overburden these landowners with frivolous contacts and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the liability and the legal risks. And some people think that that's the largest one out there, but in my perspective, it really isn't. Taking them one at a time, the private lands access issues and in respect to their use of their lands, I mean, first and foremost, you better be following through what you promised that landowner, okay? You have to be credible with that. So again, it comes into flexibility, whether you're having to adapt to rotating to their crop schedules, if it's an ag situation. Some areas, our access has to evolve around accommodating hunting seasons because some of these property owners have bought it for their recreational use because they are a hunter. So we have to be understanding and accommodating of that. Sometimes we have no option but to go right through the middle of somebody's property to make the connections work because it's all the jigsaw puzzle of putting the access together, especially on the private lands. But you have to be accommodating. You know, generally if we can stay to the outside fringes, especially if it's like a farm place and there's residential areas there, you know, relocate. You know, and getting into particular things we'll talk more about, but building the fences, planting trees, things that you invest for them on their property to try to help manage your use and other use on there. And then get into things like considering curfews, speed limits, things that, you know, basically are out there that are more regulatory but are sometimes really important. Bottom line is you got to be flexible to accommodate their use because it is their land. Back to number 2, that changing business and economic needs. This has really dramatically affected our private lands access as we've seen communities evolve, grow, subdivisions pop up out in the middle of nowhere where used to be nothing but fields or timber forever. There's the other thing that comes into play is that landowners get older, you know, whether it's death, divorce, aging, they have real issues that are economically driven that they have to respond to. And this is a tough one because the bottom line is if the landowner's main issue with not being able to work with your access for snowmobiling is economic, it generally takes a lot of bucks in the end if you really want to stay where you're at versus having to adapt and move to something different with it. The environmental impacts, the best way to manage that, again, is to always follow best management practices. Again, the access guide gives a lot of good suggestions with that. But again, we need to be sensitive to what we impact their land with, their vegetations. Not only, you know, we can go out there in the wintertime and what we impact it with melts and goes away. But if the trail we've built or the opening we've put through their timber or whatever we've done there leaves a scar for the other 6 or 8 or 10 months of the land, however that season offsets, then they're going to look at that more months of the year than what we do as snowmobilers. And so we have to be sensitive to that impact and the off-season with that as well. So again, you know, I think there's a lot of things we can do as trail partners to help them with that and help them with their management. But bottom line is that if they think that you're being disruptive to the environment on their property, we've got a tough go with it. The topic of off-season impacts, this is huge, okay? First and foremost, we always hear about all the nightmares, and they are real nightmares, with what I'll call unmanaged ATV off-road vehicle use. It is not because they're bad people, because about half the time they're us, okay? About half of the snowmobilers are also, or more, are also ATV riders, okay? What has happened is that the other part of the season, the wheeled use, the ATV use, is not being properly managed. And going back to some of those other factors, the interfering with use in the off season and stuff, again, outside the snow season, we can probably be a livable thing from a landowner's perspective. But if they have, if it's pasture land, they have their livestock out there, or agricultural crops or timber operations, we have a conflict. But the bottom line, and I think this is a huge one going forward if we want to continue to have private lands access and even public lands, but particularly on private lands, is that we have to invest in off-season, summer, fall maintenance of these trails, helping these landowners manage what they'll call the off-season impacts to your snowmobiling. The administrative headaches, again, we just need to be sensitive. Sometimes we create more hurdles than what's necessary, but in the bottom line, you have to talk about, a good paper trail, manage the risk, but at the same time, you just have to bend over backwards and be accommodating for them. What you don't want to do, probably the worst thing to do, is that, every year you change your mind about your trail location, so then you're back in their office, back in their yard, saying, we want to move our trail 10 feet this way, 50 feet this way. So we need to have a good plan going in first time so that we're not there with it. The liability and the legal risks, again, a lot of people think this is the huge issue out there, and it is. It's a real issue. We have to be sensitive to it. But I think that the best thing that we have is that I would say every state, or almost every state, has some type of what they call a recreational use statute. And again, the access guide, Appendix 1 there, lists, number one, the link to your state's recreational use statutes, and it printed out, at least the way it looked in 2008 when we published this. We haven't updated since then, but not a lot has changed with that. What it generally says is that there is some type of law in every state that minimizes the risk to the landowners, private and public, for allowing free public access for recreational uses. Okay, now some states allow an incentive payment, so you can pay a few $100 to a landowner, and that's not viewed as paid access. But other places where you go out there and you'd have to pay to be a club member, you know, like a hunting preserve is the best thing. You have to be a member of the hunting preserve, and then you can get access to that land. Those folks lose that recreational use statute in the hunting perspective because they're charging to come hunt on that land. So again, every state is different, but the good news with this particular hurdle out of that list of 6, the last one, is that it's manageable because we have some good state laws out there. But at the end of the day, it doesn't prevent anybody from being sued, so that comes back to you following through and doing a good job of saying what you're going to do to help them manage their risk. Just briefly, there's about 5 different types of what I'd call private landowner permission. You know, a lot of our snowmobile trails started a long time ago. We have a lot of snowmobile trails that then, and sometimes even now, exist out there with a verbal permission, you know. We get together at the table and we shake our hands and say, yeah, you're good to go. That works in some communities, but as some of those other factors, especially the changing times and the changing needs, there's not a lot of security in having that kind of access out there. So, you know, it's better to get something in writing so at least you know if you're going to get kicked off, you know what the process is going to be. Because as you work up the rest of it, the revocable permit and the written lease puts something into a little bit of a framework. The revocable permit is a very short document typically. Then again, there's some examples in the manual. But the bottom line is that the landowner retains the right to basically give you very short notice that trail's out of there, okay? The written lease is a little bit better. It typically puts a few more stipulations in there as to what the landowner agrees to do, what the trail provider agrees to do, what you're going to do for the landowner, and it'll generally say that you get a 30-day or a 60-day notice or whatever it might be that either one of you can cancel it. So again, it's better. It's probably by far the most common thing that's in practice with private access. But there's really no long-range security in it. Often 1 year at a time. Sometimes folks do a written lease for maybe 3 to 5 years, but it's, again, not very long-term. And then there's 2 types of what I would say pretty good long-term access. Generally costs some money to do that. The right-of-way easement or conservation easement. In either case, you're essentially taking a corridor and you're getting written permission, in some cases for perpetuity, okay? And so often, because you're giving up, the landowner is giving up something to you for that long term, they're typically going to get at least a front-end one-time payment out of a right-of-way easement in particular. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's low cost, sometimes they want to charge you big bucks because they're going to give it up for a long term. The difference between the right-of-way easement and the conservation easement is that the conservation easement, you would typically end up with something like a land trust or a foundation or somebody who has acquired rights. And this is very common in the environmental world, okay? We have lots of land trusts out there locking up land. And a lot of times when we get involved with a land trust, it's not necessarily a good news item for snowmobilers unless you're invested in a partnership with that land trust. So if you are out there with, again, the need to lock up things as your property is changing, especially as, you know, as we see the suburbia creep and things like that, land trusts, conservation easements, right away, it's the way to go if you really want to invest in long term. Otherwise, we're going to have to accept that some of our trails that have maybe been there for decades are eventually going to go away, okay? We just simply can't keep operating that same system, and a lot of times that's our connection to the communities and to services if we have to get away from that. just to kind of button up the private piece of this for it, again, the long-term success, favorable risk management, it's critical. We have to work with the landowners, working with them. More importantly, as a trail organization, we have to provide proper trail management. It's the key to being credible, maintaining that relationship going forward. You just have to do that. So again, these are the decision points as to what a landowner would say, yeah, we're willing to work with you and let a snowmobile trail cross our private property. So again, some of those landowners will say yes because they understand that you can bring them favorable risk management. So between their recreational use statutes and the trail provider working with them to do a good job, then that can sometimes get you a yes. The community goodwill, I think that's how a lot of our snowmobile trails started, especially in the rural areas. The club formed locally, they went out, they knew the landowners. Sometimes we still have that situation today. Sometimes that's changed dramatically. But that community goodwill is typically tied to a personal connection between somebody in the club and the landowner in there. It's really, really critically important that you continue to build and nurture those relationships. The third motivator can be political support. This is most common with a corporate landowner or somebody that's in big business, or they have something, a mining company, okay? If you can say to them that we're going to help provide good risk management, they can maybe see the carrot at the end of the stick is that, okay, we can get some political support because not everybody loves us because we're a timber operator or a mining company or whatever. It depends on the community. So it can be a driver for those types of folks. Money, it's a huge motivator for some. Other landowners really don't care about it. It's a difficult one. Again, some states will allow an incentive payment. Others will not allow that. Tax reliefs and benefits in that, sometimes again, the greatest tax relief comes through working with like a conservation easement, so there's a donation, they end up with a tax write-off through the IRS on their end of the year taxes, and some states actually have some type of a formal property tax rebate if there's access, but that's pretty rare. I think but the bottom line is that if you're going to have a private landowner who's going to agree to give you access for a snowmobile trail, they desire responsible and responsive management, okay? Again, I come back to that credibility thing. You have to show the landowner that you're going to be credible, you're going to help them provide reasonable access, but you have to be prompt in what you said you're going to do and be credible in the end. That's a quick run through on the private, on the public side of it. And we'll come back and be lots of opportunity for questions, but try to get through the introductory stuff. What is different on the public side of it, and again, this can be something like the National Forest, which is the largest provider of public lands, or all the way down to your state forest, state parks, county lands, municipal lands. It's all kind of the same model. You know, it gets blown up, and I'm going to talk big picture, probably from the Forest Service, but that same model, the message is that same model typically transfers to any type of public lands, okay? There's a process. And so whereas our private lands are so driven by that working relationship, the public lands require the working relationship, but they also require us to work a process. So you need to learn what that is at your level. Again, maintain and establish those positive partnerships, and you got to be patient and persistent. Public lands access certainly doesn't happen at the table with a handshake this week or next month. These processes, if we're lucky, get completed in a few months. And unfortunately, a lot of things like forest planning, they take years. Been working on a forest plan revision in Wyoming that started 7 years ago. So as we've seen the forest planning rules start, stop, they start, stop with the process. So we're back to it, and we're hoping that we're close to it. So they'll wear you out. Yellowstone's another example, you know, it's just process fatigue. But there is still a process. And as long as we stay in the process, we still have a shot at access. If we get tired of the process, then we're out. And again, as I mentioned, the Forest Service is by far the largest public provider of snowmobile trails in the U.S. It is a challenge, let me tell you. I worked with the Forest Service closely for years. A lot of those folks are my good personal friends. But just because it's the Forest Service doesn't mean it's the Forest Service and it's consistent, okay? Just like everything else, just like your clubs, just like your associations, it is influenced by personalities, okay? And sometimes those people are our friends and sometimes they really don't like us, but yet they're the decision maker. They still control the process. We still have to be respectful, we have to be honest, we've got to be credible. Doesn't matter whether we're dealing with the Forest Service chief or the county park superintendent. You got to work your way down to the ground, you got to work the food chain, but you got to work the process, and that involves a lot of different personalities. So we have to take the high road. If we're going to get to the end of the process and be respected, as much as we'd like to say that, you know, you're really, we can't do that. We have to stay focused and be positive. I'm going to talk really briefly about NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, created by Congress back in 1969. This is in place in a lot of states as well, okay? We always hear about NEPA, the National Act. There are a lot of state environmental policy acts. It's the same model to a great extent. So again, you need to understand what NEPA is, or your SEPA, or whatever it's called, local level. The good news is it gives us a process. It gives us a seat at the table so that we have a chance to go in there. Because, you know, I'm going to tell you something. The groups that don't like us, they have a hell of a lot more numbers, okay? There are a lot more numbers of folks out there, and we saw Ed's numbers this morning, and you know how in not very many years the number of snowmobile units sold in the U.S. and Canada and elsewhere, you know, the folks that are in the room here, our numbers have gone down dramatically, okay? Worldwide, yeah, we're up some, but we're engaged locally. And locally, I think a lot of our numbers have gone down. I don't care what the community is. So it's kind of broadened the inventory, but it's still there. So the good news is that these environmental laws, as much as we don't like them a lot of times, they guarantee us a seat at the table and a part in the process. NEPA is not a vote. As much as we work to get all kinds of comments in there, one good substantive letter that spells out things succinctly, addresses the plan versus all the what ifs and all the boogeymen that are out there, one good letter will get us just as far in a NEPA process or a state SEPA process as what 100,000 from all the antis will on their website out there, okay? That's a reality. Those decisions are not made on numbers. It's affected, okay? They're human beings, going back to these personalities. It's affected by lots of people weighing in on one side or another, so we can't sit on our hands and, you know, depend on only one person to submit one good letter. We have to work the process. And again, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, the state acts, even counties and municipalities have some of these, but there are three what I'll call triggers as to what triggers NEPA. So it can be a federal jurisdiction, so simply having federal land, okay? Or having federal money. Oh, we get a lot of federal money through RTP in some states, or whatever the process is, or because it's might not even be public lands, but if there's some federal money through things like the Jobs Act or thing, then that could trigger NEPA even on a private or a county land. And then certainly if federal employees are out there. So there's lots of triggers. And just briefly, you have to understand that there's about 3 different basic levels. There used to be 4. It's kind of been condensed now. So you've got what I'll call the easiest process is a categorical exclusion. You hear talk around the feds and state people that use this, they'll talk about a CE, it's a categorical exclusion. It's a lowest level analysis. It's something that typically can get done in months, but a lot of that happens behind the scenes. There was a time where a CE, most of that stuff we never saw it, and the district ranger or somebody would sign something and it would happen. Now they've introduced an appeal process to a CE, a public notification, so now absolutely every piece of that will see some daylight, which is a good thing. Environmental assessments is kind of a mid-level. It's very common. It's more project specific. So if somebody's going to go build a parking lot on federal lands or develop a new trail, then it would be typical to see an environmental assessment. Typically can happen in months, often takes up to a year. The differences, examples, a CE, the categorical exclusion, would typically be something like trail maintenance, okay? So that the agency says, we're going to do this all the time. They still need a paper in the file that says that they did due diligence. Kind of relates to some of this stuff, the lawsuits we're seeing with Winter Wildlands Alliance about snowmobile trails that have been there for 30, 40 years, and now they're saying, well, NEPA wasn't done, so you got to go back and do it. And then the big monster out there is the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement. These things take years, okay? They don't happen in less than a year, and it's always multiple years. Very complex. It's the one in the EA and the EIS. We will typically see what I'll say the spectrum from really good to really scary, okay? There will be alternatives, and EA might have 1, 2, 3, or 4. And EIS will have sometimes as many as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Can be really scary stuff. We have to comment certainly on what usually they'll come out with a preferred alternative. It says this is what we want to do. It draws our attention, but we also have to comment on this other range out there, okay? We can't comment that, or fail to comment that these really scary ones that, like, I'll use Yellowstone, that all snowmobiles are gone, it's closed, snow coaches only. If we fail to comment on that, then when they do their analysis, there's no comments against the 100,000 people that'll go in there for Winter Wildlands and say, you know, this is the best thing since sliced toast. So we have to pay attention to the full range of scary stuff and the full range of good stuff, as well as what the agency's saying they're proposing to do. This is a really quick run through, but you have to understand the structure and the process with that. There's one other piece to NEPA, and that's that there's what they call programmatic analysis and site-specific. So programmatic is when they do the big EIS, like saying, this is our forest management plan. State parks could do, this is our state parks plan, so this is the big picture. This is our direction, our policy going forward. They tier off to a site-specific analysis if they're going to do things like a specific trail development or a specific parking lot or things like that. And then they say that's tiering, okay? What it does is we're just playing connect the dots, folks. Okay, they're saying tiering is going back, okay, we made a decision in the EIS for the forest plan, so the programmatic analysis said this is our sideboards for doing this. And then they will say, because that decision was partially made in the top level, they will tier down to the site-specific, which means they won't consider decisions that were made in the top level in the programmatic. So if they made a decision, this is the direction back in the forest plan or the county park plan, then they are not going to reconsider that, and that's what they call the tiering. So again, we need to understand the question that is on the table for the process, and this is where it gets really convoluted. But again, I think that the access guide gives you some tools there, and hopefully going forward we can continue to provide some tools with that. We're moving out of NEPA and more into what I'll call the big picture planning. And again, this is a ROS you'll hear about. It's a Recreation Opportunity Spectrum. It was developed by the U.S. Forest Service, but it's used by everybody, okay? All the federal agencies, state agencies, county agencies. If we look at plans, there will be something like ROS in there. It's a step, it's really, the best analogy is like land use zoning in a way. If we had a city ordinance that said this zoning was business and commercial, it's kind of a step in that direction. But Anyway, to get to their classification process is that they have these 7 settings, as they call them, and then the degree of, okay, what's the degree of access out there? Wilderness, there's not a hell of a lot of access, but for some of them that's good, but that's one consideration. Remoteness, naturalness, site management. So as you move down the list of these settings, you're starting to get into some development, visitor management, social encounters, visitor impacts. And then they tier from that, ROS, still the baseline of zoning for land planning, for access. Typically, they will change these names up somewhat, but the root of the classifications, the zones, they say you can go there or you can't go there, back to these high-level forest management things, the programmatic stuff. Primitive, okay? Primitive is our wilderness areas and the wilderness study areas sometimes. But wilderness definitely is the end of the spectrum with the primitive. Then you have semi-primitive, non-motorized. You have a typically semi-primitive motorized, roaded, natural, rural, and urban. So as you get into that rural and urban, you're getting maybe the fringes, the connectivities to communities if they're next to a forest or a county or a state forest. Surprisingly, okay, I ask this question a lot, since we don't have a lot of time to give you the answer. You can do snowmobiling typically in 2 through 6. Okay, even the one that says semi-primitive, non-motorized, we can do that sometimes as long as we work the process. It allows it in ROS at least, so we're not automatically shut out of that. We are automatically shut out by the full tier stuff on primitive. And a good example, I think, of the semi-primitive, non-motorized access, as well as the debate and the controversy that it brings us, is the Huron-Manistee fight that we've been going through in Michigan. Okay, it's where the guy tried to sue and say, you know, you can have snowmobiles or hunting, firearm hunting in semi-primitive, non-motorized. Well, you know, doesn't matter that they erred when they classified a lot of those as non-motorized, because there have been roads through there for decades. So we're in that fight, but the example is that it is common for there to be a winter. It essentially ends up being a winter motorized ROS, and then in the summertime there's no way in hell that they'll let you take a motorized vehicle in there. So it's a summertime non-motorized ROS. So it's hiking and biking and horses in the summer, and since it's remote, in the planning process there have been a lot of decisions made to allow snowmobiling access to the backcountry. And the rest of the year it's a non-motorized area. And there are also some examples where it's the flip, where for whatever reason they're allowing ATVs in there in the summertime, but not snowmobiles in the winter. It's far more common the other way, but it can work, and it comes out of the process. That's the message, okay? If we don't engage in that process, then we can't affect where they draw that line for it. Again, an example. This is kind of taking it from the ROS to a forest plan, okay? A national forest plan, state plan, whatever. And again, these 8 titles can be tweaked or changed, or they may, you know, they'll introduce things like a 1A or a 2.2. I mean, they play lots of games, but the backbone of the classification system, an MA1, 1, even a 1.1, 1.2, it's the natural processes dominate. It's our wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, special interest areas. Getting into the special areas in 2, it can be the research natural areas. I mean, all these classifications, if you worked any type of a public plan with that. Working down the list, you're getting into more active timber management, fuels management, wildlife management, all the way through there. And as you get to the bottom of the list on the 8s, that's things like your ski areas, your resorts, things like that that are allowed to be built on public lands. So again, the message is that we have the ability in the process to fit snowmobiling in to almost all those things, except the very top of the list, okay? We have the potential. If we don't work the process, we're not going to get in there, but we have the potential if we engage in the process. Working the process is important, and I think that AXA, with their Enlightenment Ride, has done a wonderful thing. It's a super model that you should be using everywhere. They've done it with the U.S. Forest Service. If you're not doing it at your state level, at your county level, at your province level, you're missing the boat. We need to get these folks out on a snowmobile. I went to work, I came out of a state parks background. I started working snowmobile trails in 1985, and I went to work with folks on the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota, and I was new to this stuff, and it's like, well, let's go out there, and we had a lot of logging going on, and we needed to reroute the trail. I found out as I worked through that process with the Forest Service folks that I was taking the folks that were managing the snowmobile trails and my contact in the district offices to places on their district they had never, ever been to, ever, summer or winter, okay? It has gotten worse since 1985 because they've lost a lot of staff and the ability to get out in the woods, okay, using the Forest Service as an example. You have to work at getting these folks out of their office so they can understand and relate to you. You also need to understand the food chain, okay? I'll use the Forest Service as an example, but it's common everywhere. The Forest Service, I mean, these are examples of folks that AXA's had out on an Enlightenment Ride, okay? Sometimes we had Winter Wildlands there on one of them, but it's an on-the-ground interaction about what happens on snowmobile trails, talk about the issues on the ground. So you have a forest supervisor up there. You've got a deputy regional forester. You've got the national recreation director out of the Washington office. The bottom of it, you've got the district ranger, a couple of them, and a district rec staff in the middle. Who makes the decisions on that stuff? Hopefully you can see this in the back, but it's kind of it's showing out of kind of two columns of how the Forest Service is structured. Okay, the right side is what they call the line officers. Chief of the Forest Service, the regional foresters, there's 9 of them. Forest supervisors, 155. At least when this slide was made, they keep combining, so that number keeps reducing. 626 ranger districts when this slide was put together. Those folks on the right are the line officers. They're the only people in the whole U.S. Forest Service that make decisions, okay? There's a whole lot of important people on the left side. The Director of Recreation, we saw his photo out there on an Enlightenment Ride. He's not a decision maker. Director of Recreation in the regions, they're not decision makers. They're out there with us. The recreation staff on the forest, they're not decision makers. A very important person, that rec person at the district level, they're not a decision maker. Who makes most of the decision? It's the guy, or most cases the gal now, because there's a lot more district rangers that are women. These folks down here, the district ranger, they make the predominant number of decisions. It's a bottom-up decision structure, and it's true in a lot of public agencies. The power rests at the ground. You have to engage the top layer, you have to engage the left layer, but if you're not engaged with your district ranger and the folks on the right side of that line, you've lost the game, folks, okay? It takes a lot of work, it takes perseverance because these things go on for years. And what else happens? It's a revolving door. Sometimes it's months, sometimes it's years. If you're lucky, you got somebody that's there for a decade. If you got somebody there that's for 5 years, you're really lucky. If you get over a decade, it's like almost unheard of, but that person is a good person to be plugged into because they know the system and they will help you work the food chain if you establish that relationship with them. So again, really quick walkthrough with that. Again, I'll bring you back to the access guide. There are so many things in there, lots of information, resources. Part of this presentation is about, okay, we're talking about increasing access, how do we reduce the conflict? There's a whole chapter in the access guide about tools for improving and retaining your access. There are a number of topics. Again, there's a whole piece of it in the guide, but just to kind of summarize some of the many tools, because we have lots of tools out there to help us with it. That trail system and layout and design, we've touched on some of this with the landowner concerns, routing away from their building sites and where they're at, you know, avoiding the sensitive areas, fencing, curve sweeping, you know, the curve, and then your trail layout. If you know you got a speed issue, then don't be building straightaways right past somebody's house if that's where we're at. I mean, sometimes you don't have any other choice, but if you have an option, be sensitive on the front end of that. First and foremost, try to avoid, or at least minimize that ground disturbance. Again, every activity, snowmobiling, hiking, bird watching, has an impact. We just have to manage it. The trailheads and the parking areas, there are some parts of our riding where I truly believe that parking is the root issue of all conflicts. Why? Because we essentially are not providing parking, okay? Or we're doing a poor job of providing good parking. And if we do have parking, then we're not managing the parking. If we would focus in those conflict areas, and again, some places, you guys are fortunate to be able to ride from your home or your cabin or someplace, so parking is not a huge issue. There are other locations, particularly public lands access. If we don't pay attention to managing parking, then we're losing the battle before folks even leave the parking area. Because once those folks get out, they typically disperse, and our conflicts go way down. The conflicts occur at the parking areas. So, you know, there's models in the manual to help you try to, if there's room, separate the uses, or if you gotta share a use, at least, you know, put the guys on the skis and the snowshoes close to the snow so they can get out of the parking lot, get the heck out of the way, separate the trails. If you force them to have to walk through all the unloading sleds and the trucks in the parking lot, you piss them off before you even get them onto the snow. So be cognizant of that. You know, you guys can get there like that. It takes them a little more to get there. The other thing that'll happen is that, you know, there's a zone within really no more than 3 miles of a parking area, if our management perspective is a parking area. The non-motorized folks, and therefore the conflict, the typical non-motorized user on skis or snowshoes isn't going to get beyond 1.5 to 3 miles radius from that. So that's the place to concentrate on. If we got to reroute trails, manipulate stuff, get things kind of, you know, figured out. It's not rocket science. You can go out and watch the traffic patterns, but you don't have to go out there 5 miles because you're going to get there quickly, and they're not ever going to get there, or if they do, it's been a long trek for them. Signing, I think that it's critically important that you tell people on the ground what you expect out of them, okay? I see a lot of the conflict out there because we, as trail managers, as agency managers, we fail to communicate on the ground. We say, well, it's on the website, it's on the map. It's like, you know what, especially the areas where we have high out-of-area traffic, and that doesn't have to be a non-resident, but just people that don't live in that community where you're building the trail and maintaining it, you have to communicate on the ground what you expect them to do. Now, that doesn't mean sign pollution, but effectively at access points, key stopping areas, you need to communicate what that would be. There are standard signs, and there's a whole lot of specialty signs out there. Again, be sensitive about it, but bottom line, if you don't tell them on the ground, they're not going to know. Sound laws, some people don't like these. I believe we have to invest more in sound laws and sound law management. It is a key factor to retaining our access going forward, okay? We talked at the beginning that as an industry, we have dramatically reduced our sound levels, okay? And this doesn't mean that aftermarket products have to go away, because a lot of the folks in the aftermarket world have done a great job of fine-tuning and evolving their products so that we can still manage sound. Others have failed to do that. And the bottom line is that as users and as trail managers, we need to invest in things. And one thing that has come to fruition just, over the last few years is a stationary sound test. Before it was always an old pass-by. It was unenforceable. It certainly wasn't friendly to use out there in a on-trail setting. But the stationary sound test that ISMA worked with, administrators worked with, AXA and all the other user groups worked with, went through SAE certification. It is there. We are starting to see states pass sound laws tiered to the stationary test. We all need to move there, particularly if you have an access issue, you better be managing your sound. Other local ordinances, speed limits, curfews, again, we don't like all those restrictions sometimes, but in order to keep our access, we have to invest in some of these ordinances and regulations in key spots. Maybe it's not a jurisdiction-wide thing, but there are key spots that you probably, if you really have a problem, you better get serious at looking at it. Law enforcement and education, it plays a role in our safety, but it's really important for our access, our ethics, our image of responsible use, okay? We have to invest in that, the education, and I believe a big part of enforcement is really education. It does not have to translate to something as writing citations or arresting people, but in the end you need that tool. It all has to start with an education process. Landowner recognition programs, again, huge tool. It's used a lot of places, and particularly with your private lands access, but don't forget the public agency managers, whether it's state folks, county folks, national forest folks. They are all landowners, even if it's an agency, okay? So work at those relationships and telling them thank you, okay? Thank you for, yes, it's our land, but they are managed to it. They have a difficult job on the public side of it as well as the private, making things balanced. So keep the full circle of recognition out there. Monitoring, I believe, is critical. Some areas are doing this, a lot of us don't. Today's age with digital cameras, phone cameras, you need to be taking photos of the same spot summer and winter, okay? We have a lot of us take our photos, our favorite spot in the wintertime, so we have that collection. We need to work at getting back to those same spots in the off-season to document the impacts. Well, the impacts truly are that there's a lot of vegetation out there, okay? When the snow melts, the snowmobile trail impacts have really disappeared. But when you go into these processes and you fight for access, again, particularly on public lands, but it can happen in private or corporate, is that you have to be able to dispel the myth that you're tearing up the land out there and, it's all these horror stories and you're going to have them. And might be a shock, it might not be, but a lot of our opposition, I don't think they always get hung up on the truth, okay? Photo documentation is the best tool you have. It gets packaged as monitoring. It's just simply doing what you do. Continue to take photographs. Again, you get back out there, a lot of us are ATV riders, you're hikers or whatever. Take photos other times of the year and not just the winter time. And then maintain that inventory so you have some documentation. It doesn't have to be every piece of ground out there, but at the same time as you get into specific planning or even force planning, if you're engaged in the process, you're going to hear, okay, this mountain, we want to close it to snowmobiles because we need it for backcountry skiers, and we have all these impacts. So if you don't have photographs for your comments, it's the greatest tool I have as I work for everybody out there putting comments together. I try to bend over backwards to put photographs right into the document, okay? It's therefore into the record, and it's there for the decision makers and the planners and the historical record, okay? So as these things sometimes get litigated and they come back around, we have built into the record a pictorial documentation of what really is on the ground out there. Again, Don't rely on the land managers, because they may have never been to that piece of the forest or the park or wherever we're at. And sometimes even the corporate landowners, okay? The guy that's managing their lands program in a corporate office, he's probably never been to that piece of ground that it's really important for you. So take the photos. It helps educate exactly what you're talking about. Research impacts, Appendix 8 in this access guide, there's 60 pages plus and growing of research that has been done, and yeah, some of it, sometimes depending on the topic, it's organized in there on, sound and air quality and wildlife and vegetation. So it's kind of cataloged in the access guide by that. Some of those categories, those studies were done back in the 70s, 80s, sometimes even the late 60s. People say, well, it's so damn old, we got to update it. You know what? Yellowstone has updated some of that stuff for us. As ugly as the whole Yellowstone winter use access, it has brought us some of the best research favorable to us. And you'll hear the Winter Wildlands Alliance actually tell their girls, oh, you don't want to bring that up. You don't want to bring that up, okay? Because what these new studies have done, and the newer studies are typically going to be related to Yellowstone, or they're going to be related to ATVs. Why? Because ATVs are the new bad guy out there on the market. But there's similarities in the research, and if it was done by a university or an agency researcher versus the stuff like we read about where Wildlands is given a grant to somebody at a college that $2,000 this year to go out and collect snow samples, and then they came up with an extra $3,000, $4,000 this year, a year later, to analyze the snow samples. It's like, that's junk science. They're going to throw it at us, but there are good studies out there in our basket already, and we need to continue to partner. And I say partner to do more research, because this stuff can be dang expensive. You don't do credible research for $2,000 or $4,000 on this stuff. When you get in, university professors and the other folks that are going to bring credibility to this stuff, you're talking about sometimes big bucks. But you can get your name on that for sometimes a little bit of money, okay, and a seat at the table in it. So we need to, number one, don't discount what we have out there, because there's good stuff, even if it dates back to the 70s and 80s. All the fears about what snowmobiles were going to do to the deer yards and the mice and all this stuff. They looked at it back then, they found out that it really wasn't a big deal, and nothing's changed. Nothing's changed over the years. So, because the other side has no more recent study that's credible to bring to the table. So again, even though it's aged, it's still pertinent. But we can't stop and build on that, so we need to look for partners going forward. Partnering in that newer research, again, it comes in goofy places sometimes. Again, wildlife monitoring, it scares the hell out of us sometimes. But again, Yellowstone, they've done a ton of it. On the emissions and the sounds, the SAE Clean Snowmobile Challenge, that's been great. Two fronts, it's helped with some research, and it's also brought some of those young folks out of the colleges and onto the payrolls of our manufacturers. And so it's been a good grooming program for that. And then things like the Wolverine research. And I have to admit, this is something that initially Idaho Snowmobile Association jumped into. The little orange thing that's there, it's a GPS tracker. It scares the hell out of me as an individual that we're partnering out there to let the government track our movements as a snowmobiler. But they did. And they ended up with good results showing that the snowmobilers, yeah, they were sometimes going out by the Wolverine dens or not. But in the end, it showed that the Wolverines also didn't move because the snowmobilers did get there. So again, on a personal level, I am afraid where some of that GPS data may come back in future land use processes saying that, well, they're using this area or they're really not using this area, but it has proved really, really important for research in Idaho, and I think other places are moving forward with it. So again, look for those opportunities to invest. You don't have to pay the whole bill. You can become a partner, and it can help us going forward. Another important tool out there, and we have a boatload of this, okay? There's a ton, and we need more, but there's a ton of existing stuff on ethics and safety materials, showing that we're responsible users, safe users, helps us retain our access. It helps us to manage the conflicts out there. So, you know, AXA, and a lot of this stuff has come through federal highway funding, but AXA, ISMA, the Safe Rider, Go Snowmobiling, IASA, CCSO, and Tread Lightly. I think sometimes we forget about Tread Lightly, but Tread Lightly is doing a much better job producing snowmobile materials than they were doing a decade ago, and I think they're an important partner out there. And again, we have to reach into the toolbox and use these things. Multiple use. We have a lot of our trails, especially on private property, where, yeah, we have to say it is there, the access is only for snowmobiling, and there's no other use allowed out there. And that has to be respected. But we have a lot of other places, and it's not just on public lands. Certainly on public lands it applies, but we need to embrace when we can, retain control, and bring other users into the fold, and never forget to remind them all that we're paying the bill a lot of times 100%, especially as decisions are made and people try to take credit for it. It's about generating that goodwill, okay? A personal peeve of mine is that as snowmobile community, we invest heavily in giving to charity. We raise tens of thousands and millions of dollars over the years to charities, and we give it away. And we fail to do a good job of funding ourselves to keep our access, okay? I'm not saying we should quit doing that, but I'll also tell you that I've been involved in land use plans and writing and seeing comments for a long time, and if I ever have seen a comment from a National Heart Association or pick the good charity saying support snowmobiling access in this plan, I'm still waiting to see the first one. I hope there's some examples out there, but personally I've never seen that, okay? So I don't think we're getting a good return on our investment of our goodwill. And again, it's not that we shouldn't do that, because goodwill is important, but at the same time, we need to think about embracing our other partnerships with that just as importantly. The other piece that's out there, in some places where I go, people hate these hybrid users, and sometimes it's the agencies, okay? There is nothing that embraces, in my opinion, multiple use more than a hybrid user. A hybrid user is the guy that has discovered that a snowmobile is the best way for him to get to the backcountry, to then go backcountry skiing or snowboarding, and sometimes it's at the edge of the wilderness, and it's not always in the mountains. It's just that going back to that average person being able to travel 3 miles from that parking area, they've discovered that, man, even in these flatland places, if I get on a snowmobile, strap my skis or my snowboard to that, I can get a little further from that parking lot, and I can have a better recreational experience. It's what we all want, okay? They're using the snowmobile. So I have started to see people come out of the woodwork in some of these crazy places about, you know, the Winter Wildlands want to close this so that we have this buffer zone around the wilderness area, which, by the way, is specifically illegal under the Wilderness Act to have a buffer zone. But nonetheless, they've embraced the snowmobile as their way to get there. And they are stepping up and helping us in the comments saying, no, we don't want that to become a non-motorized winter area, because when that happens, we can no longer get closer to the wilderness, to the boundary, or to a better backcountry experience for us.